Mary always believed that love looked ordinary, not grand gestures, not expensive gifts, just small things, a warm kitchen, a home-cooked meal, a mother showing up when her family needed her. That afternoon started like so many others. I remember standing in my daughter Emily's kitchen with my sleeves rolled up, cutting carrots on a worn wooden board while soup simmered softly on the stove. The windows were fogged from the steam, and outside, rain tapped gently against the glass. It felt peaceful, safe. Emily had called me that morning sounding exhausted. The baby had been sick all week, laundry was piling up, and she said she barely had time to think, so I drove over. Of course I did. That's what mothers do. Even at 64, I still found comfort in helping the people I loved. I brought groceries, folded tiny baby clothes, wiped counters nobody else seemed to notice, and started dinner before anyone asked. I didn't want praise. I just wanted to feel useful. And for a little while, I did. Emily stood beside me drying dishes while we talked quietly about everyday things. The baby had finally fallen asleep upstairs. The house smelled like garlic, onions, and fresh bread warming in the oven. For a moment, it reminded me of when Emily was little, back when she used to sit on the kitchen counter swinging her legs while I cooked dinner after work, back when home felt simple. Then Daniel walked in, my son-in-law. The front door shut harder than usual, followed by the heavy sound of his shoes across the floor. I glanced up and immediately felt something shift in the room. You know how sometimes anger enters before words do? That's how it felt. Emily went quiet instantly. I noticed that first. Not his face, not his voice, her silence. "Long day?" I asked gently, trying to keep things normal. He didn't answer me, just opened the refrigerator, stared inside for a second too long, then slammed it shut. I remember looking at Emily, expecting her to say something, but she kept drying the same plate over and over without lifting her eyes. I should have understood then. But mothers like me, we explain away warning signs. We tell ourselves everyone is stressed, everyone is tired, marriage is hard. I thought if I kept dinner moving, the mood would pass. So I turned back to the stove and stirred the soup. That's when it happened. Such a small moment. And yet somehow, it changed everything. Daniel walked over behind me while I was reaching for the salt. He grabbed the spoon from my hand suddenly and snapped, No, that's wrong." I blinked, confused. "Oh," I said softly. "I was just adding a little more seasoning." Before I could finish, he shoved past me with his shoulder so hard I stumbled against the counter. Not enough to fall, but enough. Enough for my heart to stop, enough for the room to go completely silent. Then he looked directly at me and shouted, "You're wrong! Useless!" The word hit harder than the shove. Useless. I don't think people realize how deeply one word can cut when it comes from someone you've spent years helping. I just stood there, still holding the salt shaker in my hand. I could hear the soup bubbling quietly behind me, like nothing had happened. And the strangest part? Nobody moved. Emily didn't say anything. Not immediately. Not even, "Daniel, stop." Nothing. I looked at my daughter, waiting for her to look shocked, angry, protective. But she just stared down at the towel in her hands, and I felt something cold spread through my chest. Daniel kept muttering under his breath while stirring the pot aggressively, acting as though I had ruined everything. I couldn't even process what had happened. My mind kept trying to soften it. He's stressed. He didn't mean it. He's tired from work. Maybe I was in the way. That's what hurt women do. We search for excuses before we allow ourselves to admit we were humiliated. I quietly stepped back from the stove and wiped my hands on a dish towel that suddenly felt too heavy to hold. "I was only trying to help," I whispered, but nobody answered. The kitchen that had felt warm only minutes earlier now felt unfamiliar, like I was standing in someone else's home. I remember staring at the family photos on the refrigerator, baby pictures, vacation magnets, drawings taped to the freezer, proof that I belonged there. And yet, in that moment, I had never felt more unwanted. A few minutes later, Emily finally spoke, softly, too softly. "Mom, maybe just sit down for a while." That was it. No anger toward him, no concern for me, just quiet avoidance. And somehow, that hurt more than the shove itself. I sat alone at the kitchen table pretending to look at my phone while Daniel continued cooking loudly, slamming cabinet doors like I had committed some terrible offense. I could feel tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall there, not in front of them, not after spending my whole life trying to be strong for everyone else. The drive home that night felt longer than usual. Rain blurred the windshield while I replayed the moment again and again in my head. The shove, the word, Emily's silence. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. When did I become someone they could disrespect so easily? And deep down, beneath all the excuses I was making for them, a painful thought had already begun forming inside me. Maybe this wasn't the first sign. Maybe it was only the first one I finally refused to ignore. The strange thing about heartbreak is this. Sometimes it doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it slips quietly into ordinary days, into unanswered phone calls, into shorter conversations, into the silence between people who used to feel like home. After that night in Emily's kitchen, I kept telling myself things would go back to normal. I wanted to believe Daniel had simply lost his temper. Everyone has bad days. At least that's what I kept repeating to myself while lying awake at night staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above my bed. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. The first change was the phone calls. Emily used to call me almost every day, sometimes just to ask how long to bake chicken, sometimes to complain about laundry piling up, sometimes for nothing at all, just little conversations mothers remember forever. But after the incident, the calls became shorter, then less frequent, then strangely formal. "Hi, Mom. We're busy today. Maybe next week." Like I had become someone she needed to manage instead of someone she loved. I noticed it immediately. Mothers always do. One afternoon, I stood in the grocery store holding Emily's favorite soup in my hands because she'd mentioned having a cold earlier that week. Without thinking, I drove it over to her house, the way I always had. I remember standing on the porch holding that warm container while rain dripped from the edge of the roof. When Emily opened the door, she looked surprised. Not happy, surprised. "Oh," she said quickly, "you didn't have to do that." I smiled anyway. I was nearby, I lied, because the truth was, I had driven 20 minutes just to feel needed again. Inside the house, everything felt different. Not openly hostile, just uncomfortable, like walking into a room moments after an argument ended. Daniel barely looked at me when I came in. He muttered hello without lifting his eyes from his phone. And Emily kept acting overly cheerful in that fragile way people do when they're trying desperately to avoid tension. I could feel it sitting at the table with us. The thing nobody wanted to name. The shove, the insult, the humiliation. But nobody mentioned it. Not once. I thought to myself, maybe they're waiting for me to bring it up. So finally, while Emily was rinsing dishes, I spoke quietly. "Emily, about what happened the other night." Her shoulders stiffened instantly, and before I could even finish, she interrupted me softly. "Mom, can we not do this right now?" I just stood there, holding my coffee cup, feeling foolish for thinking my own daughter might want to talk about the moment her husband put his hands on me. "I just felt hurt," I whispered carefully, and then she said something I still hear in my head sometimes late at night. "You know how stressed Daniel's been lately?" That sentence, so simple, so devastating, because in that moment I realized she wasn't asking if I was okay. She was explaining him to me, protecting him from me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. For a second, I actually questioned myself. Maybe I should have stayed out of the kitchen. Maybe I criticized too much without realizing it. Maybe older mothers become difficult and nobody tells them. It's amazing how quickly a woman can start shrinking herself after being treated badly. I went home that evening and sat alone at my dining room table long after dark. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I looked around at all the little pieces of my life, family photos, birthday cards, old drawings Emily made when she was 6 years old, proof of decades spent loving people with everything I had, and yet somehow I suddenly felt like an outsider in my own family story. The hardest part wasn't Daniel, not really. People like him reveal themselves eventually. No. The hardest part was watching my daughter slowly become silent beside him. Weeks passed, then months. I still visited sometimes, but only when invited. And even then I noticed new rules forming around me. Daniel correcting little things I said. Emily changing the subject whenever tension appeared. The way they exchanged glances sometimes after I spoke. Tiny things. Tiny, painful things. One evening during dinner, I reached to wipe spaghetti sauce from my grandson's cheek. Daniel immediately grabbed the napkin first and said sharply, "We've got it. We've got it." I smiled to cover the sting, but inside something cracked quietly. Because I wasn't trying to control anyone. I was just being a grandmother, just being me. After that, I started apologizing constantly. Sorry, I didn't mean to interfere. Sorry, I was only helping. Sorry. The word became automatic, like I needed permission to exist around them, and the more careful I became, the more invisible I felt. One night, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror while washing my hands at Emily's house. I looked tired, smaller somehow. I stared at myself and thought, when did I become so afraid of taking up space? That realization stayed with me all the way home, because somewhere between trying to keep the peace and trying not to upset anyone, and trying desperately to remain welcome in my daughter's life, I had stopped asking myself a very important question. Why was I the only one carrying the shame for something that was done to me? And for the first time, I began wondering what would happen if one day I simply stopped trying so hard to belong there at all. There comes a moment in some women's lives, a quiet moment. Not loud, not dramatic, just a small, painful realization that settles into your chest one ordinary morning and refuses to leave. Mine came while I was folding towels. I remember standing in my laundry room matching socks under the soft yellow light overhead when my phone buzzed beside me. A message from Emily. "Can you pick up groceries before you come tonight?" No hello, no how are you, no warmth, just another favor. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, and suddenly, something inside me felt tired. Not angry, just tired. Tired of showing up with arms full while leaving with a heart that felt emptier every time. Tired of pretending things were normal. Tired of apologizing for existing. Tired of shrinking myself so other people could stay comfortable. I sat down slowly on the edge of the couch, holding my phone in both hands, and for the first time in months, I didn't answer right away. The silence in my little house felt different that day, peaceful. I looked around at the life I had built for myself over decades, the framed photos, the crocheted blanket draped across the chair, the books stacked beside the lamp, the tiny basil plant growing in the kitchen window. A quiet life, a good life. And I thought to myself, why have I been acting like my value depends on whether other people appreciate me? That question changed something inside me, not all at once. Healing never works like that, but slowly, steadily, like sunlight returning after a long winter. That evening, I texted Emily back. "Sorry, sweetheart, I can't make it tonight. Hope you all have a good evening." Simple, kind, but different. Because for once, I didn't explain myself. I didn't invent excuses. I didn't rush to fix everything. I didn't abandon my own peace just to keep someone else comfortable. And strangely, nobody argued. Days passed. Then another week. The phone stayed quiet longer than usual. At first, the silence hurt. I won't lie about that. There were moments I sat in my kitchen staring at my coffee cup, wondering if I had done the wrong thing. Mothers are trained to feel guilty for choosing themselves, even after giving everything. But little by little, something unexpected happened. I began breathing easier. I started taking morning walks again. I visited the small bookstore downtown that I used to love before life became so consumed by everyone else's needs. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center. Can you believe that? At 64 years old, sitting beside strangers learning how to paint flowers badly. And yet, I cannot explain to you how alive I felt. One afternoon, another woman in the class asked me, "So what do you do for yourself?" I almost cried hearing that question, because I realized I hadn't asked myself that in years. My entire identity had quietly become tied to helping people who barely notice the cost anymore. Then one Sunday afternoon, Emily finally called. I could hear tension in her voice immediately. "Mom, we haven't seen you much lately." I stood by the kitchen window while rain rolled softly down the glass. Old Mary would have apologized instantly, but this time, I answered honestly, "I think I needed some space." Silence. Then she sighed softly. "Well, Daniel thinks you've been distant." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Daniel, the man who shoved me, the man who called me useless, now upset because I had stopped offering pieces of myself so freely. For a second, anger flickered inside me, but it disappeared just as quickly, because I suddenly understood something important. People become uncomfortable when the person they took for granted finally stops accepting less than kindness. I spoke carefully, calmly. "Emily, I love you very much, but I won't stay in places where I'm treated without respect anymore." The line went quiet, and in that silence I felt years of pain sitting between us, not screaming, not exploding, just sitting there honestly for the first time. Emily's voice became smaller then, almost childlike. "I didn't know you felt this bad." That sentence broke my heart a little, because part of me wanted to ask, how could you not know? But another part of me understood the truth. Sometimes people grow so used to our strength, they stop noticing when we're hurting. We talked for a long time that night, not perfectly, not magically, but honestly. And honesty can be the beginning of healing, even when it arrives late. After we hung up, I stood alone in my kitchen listening to the clock tick softly on the wall. The same kitchen where I had spent years cooking for birthdays, holidays, celebrations, heartbreaks, a mother's kitchen, a mother's life. I realized then that dignity isn't something other people hand back to you after hurting you. You reclaim it yourself, quietly, piece by piece, by finally understanding that love should never require humiliation to survive. I still love my daughter, I always will, and maybe one day our relationship will fully heal. Maybe Daniel will change, maybe he won't. But one thing changed forever after that day in the kitchen. Me. Because the moment I stopped begging to be valued was the moment I finally remembered I already was.